At my husband's funeral reception, my mother-in-law did not offer me a shoulder to cry on. Instead, she slapped my 8-year-old son across the face and ordered me out of her mansion. She thought I was just a penniless widow she could finally discard. She had no idea that one phone call from me would bring federal agents to her doorstep and leave her entire family begging on their knees. My name is Natalie, and at 33 years old, I learned that grief is a luxury when you are surrounded by vultures. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your child from toxic relatives who mistake your quiet kindness for weakness. We were standing in the grand foyer of my mother-in-law Sylvia's sprawling estate in upstate New York. The air was thick with the scent of expensive white lilies and the low murmur of wealthy guests clinking crystal champagne flutes. This was supposed to be a sacred mourning period for my husband David, who had died suddenly just weeks before. Yet to Sylvia and her circle of elite friends, this reception felt much more like a high society networking event. I stood in the corner wearing a simple black dress, holding the small trembling hand of my 8-year-old son Leo. His eyes were red and swollen from crying all morning. He had just lost his father, and he was utterly overwhelmed by the sea of strangers wearing custom suits and designer gowns. I tried to keep us out of the way, but the massive grand foyer was incredibly crowded. Leo shifted his weight nervously and took a small step backward. His elbow brushed against a tall glass highboy table draped in white silk. A crystal goblet filled with ice water tipped over and shattered against the imported marble floor. It sent a huge splash of water across the pristine tiles. The cold water landed mere inches away from the expensive shoes of my sister-in-law Nadine. Nadine is 30 years old, a stunning African-American woman who owns a successful chain of luxury fashion boutiques downtown. She has always prided herself on being the absolute epitome of wealth, and she made sure everyone knew it. She was holding a limited edition Hermes bag and wearing a silk dress that cost more than my first car. When the water splashed near her heels, Nadine let out a piercing shriek that silenced the entire room. All the quiet networking conversations stopped abruptly as every single eye in the grand foyer snapped directly toward us. "Look at what you did, you little brat!" Nadine hissed loudly, her beautiful face contorted in absolute disgust. Before I could even reach down to pull Leo away from the broken glass, Nadine stepped forward. She shoved my grieving 8-year-old son violently by the shoulder. Leo stumbled backward, his small frame shaking as he lost his balance and fell hard onto the solid marble floor. He let out a sharp cry of pain, grabbing his wrist. I dropped to my knees, instantly reaching for him, but before I could comfort my child, a heavy, intimidating silence fell over the massive room. The large crowd of wealthy guests parted respectfully as Sylvia marched aggressively toward us. My mother-in-law wore a custom black couture suit and a heavy string of pearls that gleamed brightly under the grand chandelier. Her face was a terrifying mask of pure aristocratic rage. I desperately expected her to immediately reprimand Nadine for laying hands on a defenseless child. I expected her to show just a single ounce of compassion for her young grandson who had just buried his father hours ago. Instead, Sylvia looked down at little Leo with utter absolute contempt. She did not ask if he was hurt or offer him a hand up. Sylvia raised her right hand and slapped Leo squarely across his tear-stained cheek. The sharp crack of her palm striking his face echoed loudly off the high vaulted ceilings of the enormous mansion. The horrible sound made my blood run completely cold. Leo gasped in total shock, his hand flying to his reddening cheek as fresh hot tears spilled from his terrified eyes. He scrambled backward, pressing himself against my legs in pure helpless terror. I knelt there completely paralyzed for a fraction of a second, unable to process the sheer, unbelievable brutality of what had just happened to us. Sylvia loomed over us, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my wet face. "Take your trash and leave. You have leeched off David long enough. Get out of this house right now." Before the echo of Sylvia's cruel words could even fade from the grand foyer, a man stepped out from the crowd of onlookers. It was my brother-in-law, Trent. Trent was David's older brother and the regional director of a major commercial bank. He always wore perfectly tailored suits and carried himself with an unbearable sense of arrogance, as if he personally owned the world and everyone in it. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked down at me with a sickening smirk on his face. He did not offer an apology for his mother's violence. He did not ask if his nephew was okay. Instead, Trent reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick folded piece of paper. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the paper casually through the air. It fluttered down and landed directly at my feet right next to the puddle of spilled water. "That is the itemized invoice for the funeral arrangements," Trent said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. $45,000. Since you are the grieving widow, we figured it is only fair that you foot the bill. My mother generously covered the upfront costs, but we expect a full wire transfer by the end of the week. Do not think you can weasel your way out of this one, Natalie." I stared down at the expensive cream-colored paper resting on the wet marble. $45,000 for a funeral reception I never even wanted. I had begged them to let us have a small private service for David. I wanted a quiet place where Leo could say goodbye to his father in peace. But Sylvia and Trent insisted on throwing this lavish spectacle purely to show off to their elite country club friends. And now they were trying to weaponize their own extravagance and saddle me with the crippling debt. Before I could even formulate a legally appropriate response, Nadine stepped up right beside her husband. She crossed her arms over her designer silk dress and looked me up and down with unhidden disgust. "Honestly, Trent, you are wasting your breath." Nadine scoffed loudly, making absolutely sure the surrounding guests could hear every single word. "Look at her. She is 33 years old and still dressing off the clearance rack. She probably does not even have $45 to her name, let alone 45,000. Nadine took a step closer, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She pointed a perfectly manicured nail at the simple, modest black dress I was wearing. "I mean, really, Natalie," she continued, her voice loud and shrill, echoing off the walls. "You could have at least tried to look presentable for my brother's funeral. But I guess we should not expect much from someone who has been a penniless burden to this family since day one. You trapped David with a pregnancy 8 years ago, and you have been relentlessly leeching off his bank accounts ever since." The sheer audacity of her words made my chest tighten with a furious, burning heat. Nadine loved to play the role of the ultimate self-made billionaire. She constantly bragged to society magazines about her expanding chain of luxury fashion boutiques downtown. She wanted everyone to believe she was a genius entrepreneur, but the reality was far darker. Everyone in the inner family circle knew she started that business with a massive high-risk loan. She bullied Trent into securing for her through his bank. She lived her entire life on borrowed money and hidden credit card debt, yet she stood there looking down her perfectly contoured nose at me as if I were dirt beneath her expensive shoes. "You really thought you hit the jackpot when you married into this family, did you not?" Nadine sneered, leaning in close so I could smell the overpowering, suffocating scent of her designer perfume. "Well, the free ride is officially over, sweetheart. You are not going to drain another single cent from us. You are a complete embarrassment to the family name. Grab your brat and walk out the front door right now before I have my personal security throw you out like the absolute trash you are." Trent chuckled softly, wrapping his arm around Nadine's waist, as if they had just delivered the punchline to a brilliant joke. The wealthy guests standing around them murmured in agreement, casting harsh, judgmental glares in my direction. They were entirely convinced by the false narrative Sylvia and Trent had spun for years. The narrative that I was a worthless, helpless gold digger who brought nothing but shame to their prestigious, wealthy bloodline. They looked at me expecting to see a broken, shattered woman. They expected me to burst into pathetic tears, scoop up my crying child, and run away into the night in absolute humiliation. They wanted me to break. They desperately needed me to break so they could feel superior in their fake, hollow lives. But I did not break. I did not scream or cry or beg for their mercy. I slowly took my eyes off the ridiculous $45,000 invoice on the floor and looked directly into Trent's smug, arrogant face. The fear and shock that had paralyzed me just moments ago completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless clarity. They had severely misjudged who they were dealing with. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the chilled air of the grand foyer fill my lungs. The frantic pounding in my chest began to slow down, replaced by a steady, rhythmic beat of absolute resolve. I broke my gaze away from Trent's mocking eyes and looked down at my son. Leo was still pressed against my legs, trembling like a leaf in a storm. His small hands gripped the fabric of my black dress so tightly that his knuckles had turned completely white. The red mark on his left cheek from Sylvia's hand was growing darker by the second. I slowly lowered myself to the cold marble floor, ignoring the shards of broken crystal scattered just inches from my knees. I wrapped my arms around Leo's shaking shoulders and pulled him into a tight, fierce embrace. I did not care that my dress was soaking up the spilled water. I did not care about the hundreds of judgmental eyes burning into my back. All that mattered in that exact second was the terrified little boy clinging to me for dear life. I buried my face in his soft hair, breathing in the familiar scent of his childhood. I pulled back just enough to look directly into his tear-filled eyes. I raised my hand and gently wiped the wet streaks from his face with my thumb. "Listen to me very carefully, Leo." I whispered, my voice steady and completely devoid of the panic they so desperately wanted to hear. "You did absolutely nothing wrong. This is not your fault, and I am so incredibly proud of you. I promise you right now that you are safe. Nobody in this room will ever lay another finger on you again. Do you understand me?" Leo sniffled, looking up at me with wide, uncertain eyes. He gave a small, hesitant nod. I kissed his forehead, lingering for a second to let him feel the weight of my promise. When I finally stood back up, my knees ached from the hard floor, but my posture was perfectly straight. I smoothed down the front of my damp dress and squared my shoulders. The heavy, oppressive silence in the room had shifted. The wealthy guests who had been waiting for a spectacular emotional breakdown now exchanged confused glances. Nadine let out a loud, irritated huff, crossing her arms tighter across her chest. She clearly hated that I was not cowering. "Are you deaf as well as broke?" Nadine snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "My mother-in-law just told you to take your trash and leave. If you do not walk out that front door right now, I am calling the estate security team to physically drag you both down the driveway." I did not even blink at her threat. I did not offer a single word of defense or explanation. I simply reached into the small black clutch I was holding and pulled out my cell phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim lighting of the foyer. My thumb moved with practiced precision as I scrolled past the dozens of fake sympathy texts from relatives and found the one contact I needed. I pressed the call button and brought the phone to my ear. "Who are you calling?" Trent demanded, his arrogant smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second. "You do not have anyone to save you, Natalie. David's money is gone. Your little free ride is completely over. Put the phone away and get out of our house." I ignored him completely. The phone rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered on the other end. "Harrison here," the voice stated simply. Harrison Croft was not a family law attorney who dealt in petty domestic squabbles. He was a ruthless, high-stakes corporate litigator who specialized in massive financial restructuring and hostile takeovers. We had been preparing for this exact moment for weeks, secretly compiling mountains of indisputable evidence behind closed doors. "Harrison, it is Natalie." I spoke clearly, making sure my voice carried across the quiet space between me and my hostile in-laws. "I need you to come to the estate immediately." There was a brief pause on the line. Then Harrison spoke again, his tone shifting into pure business. "Is it time?" I looked directly at Sylvia, who was still glaring at me with unfiltered hatred. I looked at Nadine, tapping her designer heels in annoyance. Finally, I looked at Trent, who was suddenly shifting his weight nervously. Yes, I said, my words slicing through the thick tension in the room like a sharpened blade. It is time to execute the Omega Protocol. Bring the files. I lowered the phone and ended the call. The silence that followed was entirely different from the one before. Sylvia let out a sharp, abrasive laugh that shattered the quiet. It was a cruel, condescending sound that echoed loudly in the grand foyer. Trent and Nadine immediately joined her. Their laughter was a coordinated attack designed to shrink me back into the obedient, pathetic widow they desperately wanted me to be. The Omega Protocol, Trent repeated, wiping a fake tear from his eye. What is this, a cheap spy movie? You have completely lost your mind, Natalie. You are deeply unwell. Nadine stepped closer, shaking her head in exaggerated pity. Honestly, it is just sad at this point. She is having a full mental breakdown right in front of us. This is what happens when a nobody tries to play in the big leagues. Sylvia took a step forward, her face twisted into a mockingly sympathetic pout. You have always been prone to these little delusions, dear. It is exactly why my son kept you on such a tight allowance. But making fake phone calls to imaginary lawyers, that is a new low even for you. Trent pulled out his phone again, tapping the screen with his thumb. Should I call the estate security team, Mother? We can have her forcibly escorted off the property before she embarrasses herself any further. No, Sylvia raised her hand, stopping him. Her eyes locked onto mine, gleaming with pure, unfiltered malice. Let her stay. Let her wait for this imaginary savior of hers. It will be a wonderful lesson for the boy to see exactly what happens when you try to bluff your way out of reality. Let everyone in this room see the pathetic state of David's gold-digging mistake. So the brutal waiting game began. For exactly 15 agonizing minutes, the grand foyer of the mansion became a bizarre theater of psychological cruelty. Sylvia, Trent, and Nadine returned to sipping their expensive champagne holding court among their wealthy friends. They cast sidelong glances at me, loudly whispering vicious insults meant to ensure I heard every single word. They joked about my clearance rack clothes, my empty bank account, and my supposed mental instability. They were actively trying to gaslight me into believing that my own reality was a complete fabrication. They wanted the pressure of the crowded room to crush me. They wanted me to grab my crying child and run out into the cold night, carrying the crushing weight of their $45,000 fake debt. But I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle toward the front door. I simply stood my ground near the shattered crystal on the marble floor, holding Leo's hand firmly in mine. I squeezed his small fingers gently, and he looked up at me. My son could sense the massive shift in my demeanor. The quiet, terrified boy who had been cowering behind my legs slowly straightened his posture. He leaned his small weight against my side, finding immense strength in my absolute refusal to retreat. The affluent guests surrounding us began to murmur among themselves. Some looked at me with deep pity, while others watched with morbid curiosity, eagerly waiting for the punchline of the joke Trent and Sylvia had so carefully set up. The tension in the air grew thicker and heavier with every passing minute. 14 minutes slowly ticked by. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed softly. Trent finally walked back over to me, checking the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist. Well, Natalie, your imaginary friend is officially late. I think we have humored this pathetic little charade long enough. He reached out aggressively, pointing a finger toward the massive double doors of the foyer. Security is on their way right now. Grab your son and get the hell out of my mother's house before things get incredibly ugly for you. I did not look at his pointing finger. I did not look at his arrogant face. I looked past him directly toward the towering arched windows that flanked the heavy oak front doors of the mansion. The cruel laughter in the room abruptly died. It was instantly replaced by a low rhythmic rumbling sound that vibrated deeply through the hardwood and marble floorboards. Heavy tires began to crunch violently against the imported white gravel of the long, sweeping driveway outside. The noise was loud, aggressive, and entirely out of place for a subdued high society gathering. It sounded like a sudden invasion. A few of the guests standing nearest the windows gasped loudly, spilling their champagne as they peered outside. Trent frowned, turning around to follow their shocked gaze. Sylvia and Nadine froze completely, their crystal flutes hovering right near their lips. Through the sheer white curtains, we could all clearly see the imposing dark silhouettes rolling to a sudden aggressive halt right in front of the mansion. Three massive black SUVs slammed into park, blocking the circular driveway completely. The vehicles were heavily tinted and polished to a mirror shine, but it was the license plates that caused the blood to drain entirely from Trent's face. They were federal government plates. The heavy doors of the lead vehicle swung open with a synchronized heavy thud echoing through the quiet property. Who was stepping out? A tall, imposing figure stepped out of the lead black vehicle. It was Harrison Croft. He did not look like a man who had come to pay respects at a funeral. He looked like a man who had come to completely dismantle a financial empire. Harrison was in his late 50s with sharp silver hair and a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit that screamed Wall Street ruthlessness. He closed the heavy door and adjusted his cuffs. Four other men wearing equally sharp suits and carrying thick leather briefcases stepped out of the vehicles right behind him. They moved in perfect synchronization following Harrison as he walked with heavy strides up the wide stone steps of the mansion. Two security guards rushed forward to block the entrance. Harrison did not even break his confident stride. One of the men raised a document with a federal seal, and the guards stepped back. The heavy oak front doors were pushed open wide. The cold night air swept violently into the grand foyer, bringing Harrison Croft right along with it. The absolute silence in the room deepened as the wealthy guests frantically parted to make way for him. They pressed themselves against the walls, absolutely terrified. Harrison walked directly toward the center of the room, his hard, cold eyes locked completely onto Sylvia, Trent, and Nadine. He stopped right beside me and gave a short, respectful nod, acknowledging my presence and checking on Leo before turning his full, undivided attention to my hostile in-laws. Sylvia was practically vibrating with rage, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "How dare you barge into my home?" Sylvia shrieked, her voice cracking with pure indignation. "This is a private morning reception for my beloved son. You are trespassing on private property, and I want you out of here right this second before I have you arrested and thrown in jail." Harrison did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or offer any polite apologies for the sudden intrusion. He reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents bound with a heavy blue federal seal. He held the documents out directly toward Sylvia's chest, forcing her to reflexively take them into her trembling hands. "I am not here to mourn Sylvia," Harrison said, his deep voice carrying a cold, clinical authority that echoed loudly across the entire foyer. "I am here executing a direct legal order from the federal court. You have just been officially served with a comprehensive federal injunction order." Sylvia's hands shook violently as she looked down at the thick stack of legal papers. Trent leaned over her shoulder, his arrogant smirk erased and instantly replaced by a look of dawning horror as he read the front page. "What the hell is this?" Trent demanded, taking a threatening step forward. "You cannot just walk in here and hand us papers. We have high-powered lawyers. We have serious political connections in this city." Harrison offered a dark, humorless smile that did not reach his eyes. "Your local connections are completely useless against a federal mandate, Trent. Effective exactly 4 minutes ago, every single financial asset tied to Sylvia's name has been entirely frozen. That includes all personal checking and savings accounts, her massive investment portfolios, her hidden offshore holdings, and the entirety of the family estate trust. You are completely locked out of everything." The wealthy guests in the room gasped collectively, whispering furiously among themselves as the reality set in. Nadine dropped her crystal champagne flute and it shattered loudly on the marble floor right next to the one Leo had knocked over. Sylvia let out a blood-curdling scream of pure fury, crumpling the front page of the injunction order fiercely in her fists. "This is an absolute outrage," Sylvia yelled, pointing a shaking finger right at Harrison's face. "You are a liar and a trespasser. I am a respected member of this elite community, and you absolutely cannot touch my money. Trent, call the chief of police right now. Tell him we have an intruder harassing us. Have this man thrown in a jail cell immediately. Harrison simply stood there, letting her scream her lungs out. You can call the police if you want, Sylvia. In fact, I highly encourage it. Harrison replied calmly, adjusting his silk tie. But the men standing outside by those vehicles are federal marshals who are here to ensure this property and all of its assets remain strictly untouched, pending a full forensic financial investigation. If you try to transfer a single dollar or hide any assets tonight, you will be arrested for violating a federal order. You have exactly $0 to your name as of this very second. So I highly suggest that you lower your voice. The silence in the room was absolute after Harrison delivered his devastating blow. Sylvia stood completely frozen, clutching the federal documents against her chest as if they were physically burning her. But Trent refused to surrender his illusion of absolute control. He let out a loud, arrogant laugh that sliced right through the heavy tension in the grand foyer. It was a forced, theatrical sound perfectly designed to reassure the panicked guests who were slowly backing away toward the exits. He stepped directly in front of his mother, shielding her from Harrison, and aggressively adjusted his expensive suit jacket. You really think you can walk into my mother's house and threaten us with fake federal papers? Trent sneered, shaking his head in mock amusement. I am the regional director of the largest commercial bank in this entire state. I eat corporate lawyers like you for breakfast every single day. You think you can waltz in here and freeze our assets just because this pathetic widow cried to you? Let me show you what real financial power actually looks like. Let me show you what happens when you let a penniless gold digger convince you to bite the hand that feeds her. Trent reached into his tailored pocket and pulled out his sleek smartphone. He held it up high for the entire room to see, making absolutely sure everyone understood that he was still the undisputed king of this domain. Nadine let out a loud, dramatic breath of relief, crossing her arms and shooting me a wicked, victorious glare. She fully expected her husband to crush me into the marble floor and restore their absolute dominance. Trent aggressively tapped the glowing screen, dialing a highly restricted internal number for his executive banking floor. He pressed the speakerphone icon, setting the volume to maximum so every single person in the massive room could hear his impending victory. Listen to me very carefully, Natalie. Trent said, his voice dripping with pure malicious intent as the phone began to ring loudly over the speaker. You wanted to play stupid games with our money. You wanted to humiliate my mother in front of our esteemed guests at my brother's funeral. Now you are going to pay the ultimate price for your disrespect. I am going to completely obliterate your financial existence right here, right now. When I am done with this brief phone call, you will not even have enough money to buy a cup of coffee, let alone a hotel room for the night. The phone rang a second time, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the mansion. I stood my ground, holding Leo's hand tightly, keeping my face completely devoid of any emotion. Harrison stood right beside me, his hands resting casually inside his pockets, watching Trent with the mild, detached curiosity of an apex predator observing a trapped rat. Trent completely mistook our calm silence for absolute terror. His arrogant smile widened, revealing his perfectly white teeth as he paced back and forth across the marble tiles. You are going to be standing out on the street shivering in the cold winter air with your brat. Trent continued, raising his voice so the guests standing all the way in the back could hear his cruel promise. You will be begging me for cab fare in exactly 5 minutes. I might just toss you a $20 bill if you get down on your hands and knees and apologize to my mother right now. Otherwise, you and Leo can walk all the way back to whatever cheap, miserable apartment you dragged yourselves out of today. I am cutting you off forever. A voice finally crackled over the speakerphone. It was a senior account manager named Gregory, who worked directly under Trent at the downtown branch. Gregory sounded breathless and completely frantic. Mr. Trent, sir, I am so incredibly glad you are calling. We have a massive situation unfolding on the trading floor right now. Gregory stammered, his voice shaking with undeniable panic. Trent rolled his eyes, visibly annoyed that his grand theatrical moment of vengeance was being interrupted by a random banking floor emergency. Shut up and listen to me, Gregory, Trent barked, speaking directly into the bottom of his phone with extreme authority. Whatever minor issue you are dealing with down there can wait until tomorrow. I have a direct executive order for you to execute right this second. I need you to pull up the primary banking profile for my sister-in-law, Natalie. I want you to immediately flag her entire profile for suspected massive internal fraud. I want every single credit card, debit card, checking account, and emergency savings account tied to her social security number completely frozen and permanently locked out. Trent paused, letting his cruel instructions hang heavily in the silent room. He looked directly into my eyes, expecting me to finally break down and beg for mercy. "Do it right now, Gregory," Trent commanded loudly, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "Cut off every single cent she has access to and authorize a total lockdown on her financial identity. I want her completely wiped out today." The wealthy guests held their breath collectively, watching the terrifying display of Trent's absolute power. They waited for the final nail in my coffin. They waited for Gregory to confirm that my life had just been destroyed. The speakerphone emitted a faint static hiss that seemed to stretch on for an absolute eternity. The grand foyer was so quiet, you could hear the heavy crystal chandeliers gently clinking in the draft from the open front doors. Trent stood tall, his chest puffed out, waiting for the sweet, verbal confirmation of my absolute financial ruin. Sylvia had stopped clutching her federal documents for just a moment, a vicious, hopeful smile creeping back onto her face. Nadine leaned forward, practically salivating at the thought of me being thrown out into the cold street with absolutely nothing to my name. But Gregory did not immediately respond. The silence on the other end of the line dragged out agonizingly. 5 seconds passed, then 10 seconds. Trent's arrogant smile began to falter just slightly. He tapped his shiny leather shoe against the marble floor in growing irritation. Gregory Trent barked into the phone, his voice echoing sharply across the room. "Did you hear my direct orders?" I said. "Lock down her accounts immediately. Confirm the freeze right now." Gregory finally answered, but his voice was no longer just panicked. It was trembling with absolute, unadulterated terror. "I heard your instructions perfectly clear, Mr. Trent, but I cannot execute that order. I cannot freeze her profile." Trent let out a short breath of pure disbelief. He shot a confused look at his mother, then glared back down at the glowing screen of the phone in his hand. "What do you mean you cannot freeze it? I am the regional director of this entire banking network. I have top-tier executive clearance. You go into the system, you flag the social security number I just gave you, and you lock the accounts. Do I need to come down there and do your job for you?" "You do not understand," Sir Gregory stammered, the rapid clicking sound of furious keyboard typing echoing loudly through the speakerphone. "I am looking at her primary financial profile right now. The social security number you provided is not linked to a standard retail checking account or a basic consumer credit line. It is not even a standard high net worth wealth management profile. Sir, the banking system is actively blocking my override attempts, blocking your attempts." Trent repeated, his voice dropping an octave as genuine confusion began to rapidly replace his blinding arrogance. "That is completely impossible. My executive credentials override every single retail account in the state. That is exactly the problem," Mr. Trent Gregory said, his voice dropping to a terrified, desperate whisper. "This is not a retail account. The social security number for Natalie is directly tethered to a Tier 1 institutional profile. She is not a standard client. She is listed as the sole authorized signatory and current chief executive officer of ND Holdings." The name hung heavily in the air like a massive physical weight. ND Holdings. Even the wealthy elite guests standing in the room gasped collectively at the sudden mention of the massive private equity firm. It was an absolute financial titan in the state, renowned for ruthlessly acquiring distressed assets and swallowing up massive corporate portfolios. Nadine took a sudden, terrified step back, her high heels scraping loudly against the marble floor. Sylvia let out a soft, confused gasp, clutching the federal injunction papers tighter against her chest. "You are reading the computer screen wrong," Trent yelled, completely losing his composed, aristocratic demeanor. She is a broke widow. She does not own a massive private equity firm. Refresh the database, Gregory. Refresh the damn database right now before I fire you. I have refreshed it 3 times, sir. Gregory replied, sounding like he was on the absolute verge of tears. The internal security protocols on her profile are significantly higher than yours. If I try to force a freeze on the CEO of ND Holdings without a direct federal warrant, the system will automatically terminate my employment and lock down the entire branch trading floor for a massive security breach. Sir, her accounts hold more liquid capital than our entire regional branch manages combined. I cannot touch her money. Nobody in this bank can touch her money. I watched the color drain completely out of Trent's face, leaving him a pale, sickly white. His hand was shaking so badly he almost dropped his expensive smartphone onto the floor. I calmly reached down and squeezed Leo's shoulder, gently reassuring my son that the tide of this battle had permanently turned in our favor. Then I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the physical distance between myself and my terrified brother-in-law. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power does not need to scream to be heard. Gregory is absolutely right, Trent. I said, my voice smooth, cold, and perfectly composed. You cannot touch a single cent of my money. For 8 long years, I let this toxic family believe I was nothing but a helpless burden because David begged me to keep the peace. He desperately wanted to protect his fragile older brother from the crushing, humiliating reality that his little brother married a woman far more successful than you could ever dream of being. ND stands for Natalie and David. We built that firm together from the ground up while you were busy playing dress-up at a middle management banking job. Trent stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked from me to the phone in his hand and back to me, completely unable to process the absolute destruction of his reality. Sylvia stepped forward, her face pale beneath her heavy, expensive makeup. You are lying, Sylvia hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sudden terrifying doubt. David would never keep something like this from his own mother. He was my son. He told me everything about his finances. You are just a delusional widow trying to steal what rightfully belongs to this family. I did not even bother answering her. I simply took a step back and nodded to Harrison. My lawyer stepped forward, placing his heavy leather briefcase flat onto a nearby polished mahogany console table. The sharp click of the brass lock snapping open echoed loudly in the dead-silent grand foyer. Harrison reached inside and pulled out 2 thick manila folders bound tightly with thick rubber bands. He walked over to the table where Trent had thrown the $45,000 funeral invoice. Harrison swept the invoice off the edge with the back of his hand, letting it flutter to the floor. Then he dropped the first heavy folder onto the marble tabletop with a loud, authoritative thud. Let us talk about what rightfully belongs to this family, Sylvia. Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of an executioner reading a final sentence. He opened the first folder and spread a series of highly confidential acquisition contracts across the table. These are the corporate ownership documents for the elite luxury boutique franchise currently operated by your daughter-in-law, Nadine. Nadine jolted, her eyes going wide as she stared at the papers. What are you doing? Nadine shouted, taking a frantic step forward. Those are my private business records. You have absolutely no right to touch my company. I built that entire brand from the ground up with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I am a self-made woman. You are a walking financial disaster, Nadine. I interrupted, my voice echoing coldly across the room. You took out a massive high-interest commercial loan 5 years ago to fund your pathetic vanity project. When you failed to make a profit and defaulted on the payments, Trent panicked. He knew the bank board would fire him for illegally authorizing such a massive unsecured loan to his own wife. So he desperately bundled your toxic debt and sold it off to a private equity firm to hide his tracks. He just never bothered to check who actually owned the firm that bought it. I pointed directly at the contracts on the table. ND Holdings bought your debt, Nadine. We recapitalized your failing business when you were 2 days away from total bankruptcy. According to the restructuring clauses you blindly signed, I currently own exactly 80% of your entire boutique franchise. You are not a self-made billionaire. You are a minority shareholder and a glorified store manager working directly under my corporate umbrella. Nadine let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. The wealthy guests who had previously admired her business acumen now stared at her in absolute pity and disgust. Her entire carefully curated high society identity was instantly obliterated, but Harrison was not finished. He reached into the second folder and pulled out a heavy document sealed with a gold state notary stamp. He dropped it directly in front of Sylvia. "And this brings us to the family estate," Harrison announced, tapping his index finger against the heavy parchment. Sylvia looked down at the document and her breath hitched violently in her throat. "That is the deed to my home," Sylvia whispered, her hands shaking as she traced the embossed seal. "That was the deed to your home, Sylvia," Harrison corrected her smoothly. "5 years ago, you quietly took out a massive secondary mortgage against this property to maintain your extravagant country club lifestyle after your late husband's investments dried up. You defaulted on that mortgage 6 months ago. The lending institution initiated a quiet foreclosure to avoid a public scandal. ND Holdings purchased the distressed asset portfolio containing this exact property last week. The title transfer was legally finalized and recorded by the county clerk yesterday morning." Sylvia stared at the deed, her mind completely short-circuiting as the horrific truth finally set in. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a wild, feral panic. "What are you saying?" Sylvia choked out, grabbing the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. "I am saying you do not own this mansion, Sylvia." I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, leaning in so she could hear every single syllable crystal clear. "I own the marble floor you are standing on. I own the imported chandelier hanging over your head. I own the roof covering this pathetic little gathering. You just ordered me to get out of your house, but the undeniable legal reality is that you are currently standing inside my house." The grand foyer fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely and violently inverted. I was no longer the penniless widow begging for scraps. I was the landlord, and they were nothing but unwanted tenants about to face a brutal eviction. The suffocating silence that followed my declaration hung over the grand foyer like a heavy executioner's hood. Sylvia stood completely paralyzed, her mouth slightly open, unable to form a single coherent word. The absolute certainty of her privileged world had just been entirely dismantled in front of the very high society friends she spent decades trying to impress. Trent leaned heavily against the mahogany console table, his previous arrogant posture completely broken as he stared blankly at the foreclosure deed with his mother's name on it. But the financial slaughter in that room was not quite finished. Before anyone could even attempt to process the reality of my ownership, a sharp, piercing sound suddenly shattered the dead silence. It was the ringtone of a cell phone. The high-pitched electronic chime echoed loudly off the marble walls, sounding almost like a frantic alarm bell. The guests jumped nervously, turning their heads to locate the source of the noise. Nadine flinched violently. The sound was coming from the limited edition Hermes bag clutched tightly under her arm. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, suddenly painfully aware that every single person was staring directly at her. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely manipulate the gold clasp of her expensive purse. She practically tore the bag open and pulled out her glowing phone. I could clearly see the caller ID flashing brightly on her screen. It was Melissa, the general manager of Nadine's largest flagship boutique located right in the center of the upscale downtown shopping district. Nadine stared at the screen, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. Under normal circumstances, she would have simply silenced the call to maintain her carefully crafted image of unbothered elite composure. But the sheer terror of what Harrison had just revealed about her failing company had completely stripped away her common sense. Desperate to regain even a tiny fraction of her lost authority, she swiped the screen to answer and brought the phone to her ear. Her hand was trembling so violently, she accidentally pressed the speakerphone button, broadcasting the call to the entire silent room. Melissa. I am in the middle of a private family morning reception. Nadine snapped her voice, cracking terribly, as she tried to sound commanding. I explicitly told you not to bother me tonight. What could possibly be so important that you are calling me right now? Nadine. The voice on the other end of the line screamed. Melissa was completely hysterical, sobbing uncontrollably into the receiver. The chaotic background noise of the boutique bled loudly through the speaker. There were heavy boots stomping, loud, aggressive voices barking orders, and the distinct sound of glass display cases being forcefully slid open. Melissa, calm down and stop crying, Nadine demanded, her face turning an incredibly sickly shade of pale. You are embarrassing me. What in the world is going on down there? They are everywhere, Nadine. Melissa shrieked, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the mansion. There are dozens of them, men in heavy tactical jackets. They just smashed through the glass front doors and locked down the entire building. They are tearing the store completely apart. Who is tearing the store apart? Nadine yelled, clutching the phone with both hands as her knees began to visibly buckle. Who is in my store? It is the federal government, Melissa sobbed, her voice rising to a frantic, terrified pitch. It is the FBI and the IRS. They have huge yellow letters printed across their backs. They are unplugging all the computers and boxing up every single piece of physical paperwork in the back office. They told all the customers to leave immediately, and they are actively seizing all of the designer inventory. The wealthy guests in the foyer began to back away from Nadine as if she were suddenly carrying a highly contagious disease. Federal raids were the absolute worst nightmare of the elite circle. Associating with someone under active federal investigation was social and financial suicide. Seizing the inventory, Nadine gasped, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the plastic case of her phone. Why would federal agents seize my store? Tell them to stop right now. Tell them I am calling my lawyers. I tried to tell them to stop. Melissa cried out, her voice barely audible over the sound of heavy metal file cabinets being dragged across the floor. But the lead agent handed me a massive stack of federal warrants. Nadine. They are openly declaring that this entire boutique franchise is nothing but an elaborate shell company. They are looking for direct evidence of massive offshore tax evasion spanning the last 5 years. They are saying the company owes the federal government over $4 million in unpaid taxes and hidden fraudulent transfers. Nadine, they are padlocking the front doors. They are shutting us down permanently. The line suddenly went completely dead, with a sharp click, leaving only the empty static of a disconnected call. Nadine stood frozen in the center of the grand foyer. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Her perfectly constructed high society identity, her self-proclaimed billionaire status, her entire arrogant existence had just been violently erased in less than 60 seconds. Her trembling fingers finally lost their grip. The expensive cell phone slipped from her hands and dropped plummeting downward until it smashed against the hard marble floor right next to the shattered crystal glass. She slowly raised her head and looked directly at me. The condescending sneer she had worn all evening was completely gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated horror. Her eyes were wide and wild, filled with the devastating realization that she had mercilessly bullied the exact woman who held the absolute power to destroy her. She pointed a shaking finger at my face, her voice tearing through her throat in a desperate, terrified shriek. What did you do? The harsh morning sun glared intensely through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown legal firm. It was exactly 9 o'clock the morning after the disastrous funeral reception. I walked into the sleek, glass-walled conference room with Harrison Croft right by my side. I fully expected to see Sylvia and Trent looking like completely broken individuals. After all, I had just legally evicted them from their mansion and orchestrated a massive federal raid that entirely destroyed Nadine's fake boutique empire. Nadine was noticeably absent this morning, likely sitting in a federal holding cell or desperately begging defense attorneys to take her case. But to my absolute shock, Sylvia and Trent were not cowering. They were sitting at the long mahogany conference table, looking sickeningly smug. Trent was casually sipping a cup of artisanal coffee, and Sylvia was meticulously adjusting the heavy string of pearls around her neck. They looked like two predators who had just found a secret escape hatch. Sitting at the head of the massive table was Mr. Caldwell, the senior family estate attorney who had handled my late husband's basic legal affairs for years. Caldwell looked incredibly uncomfortable, nervously shuffling a thin manila folder between his hands. "Have a seat, Natalie," Trent said, gesturing lazily to the empty leather chairs across from him. He had a sickeningly arrogant smirk plastered across his face. "You pulled a very impressive parlor trick last night at the house. I will admit, you caught us completely off guard with that whole private equity ambush. But you really should have known that my brother would never actually leave his family destitute." I did not say a single word. I simply pulled out my chair and sat down, placing my leather bag on the table. Harrison sat next to me, his face an unreadable mask of solid stone. Sylvia leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished wood. "You thought you took everything from us, did you not?" She sneered, her voice dripping with pure vindictive poison. "You thought you could just sweep in and steal the family estate and ruin poor Nadine. But David was much smarter than you ever gave him credit for. He finally woke up and realized what a greedy gold-digging mistake he married." Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat loudly, interrupting Sylvia's venomous rant. He opened the manila folder and pulled out a crisp white document, placing it carefully in the center of the table. "Natalie, we requested this emergency meeting today to formally review a recently discovered addendum to David's estate plan." Caldwell explained, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "As you know, your late husband held a comprehensive life insurance policy valued at exactly $5 million. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the document. I was fully aware of the policy. David and I had set it up specifically to ensure Leo would be completely taken care of if anything tragic ever happened. Until last month, you were listed as the primary beneficiary." Caldwell continued, adjusting his glasses. "However, Trent presented our office with this newly updated directive first thing this morning. According to this document, signed and dated exactly 4 weeks before David's fatal accident, he completely revoked your beneficiary status." Trent practically beamed with arrogant pride. He leaned back in his leather chair, folding his arms proudly across his chest. "That is right, Natalie. My brother came to me in secret. He told me he was planning to divorce you and take full custody of Leo. He wanted to make absolutely sure his hard-earned money stayed within the real family." Caldwell pushed the document across the table toward me. "This new directive explicitly and legally reassigns the entire $5 million payout. It leaves 50% to his mother Sylvia and the other 50% directly to his brother Trent. It explicitly states that you are to receive absolutely nothing." Sylvia let out a sharp, victorious laugh. $5 million in pure liquid cash. She gloated, clapping her hands together softly. "That is more than enough money to hire the most ruthless legal team in the state. We are going to drag you through years of brutal litigation, Natalie. We are going to tie up your precious private equity firm in endless court battles. We will use my son's money to completely destroy you, and then we are going to petition the court for full emergency custody of Leo." Trent smiled, nodding in complete agreement. "You might own the deed to that house right now, Natalie, but you will not be able to afford the legal fees to keep it. We are going to bleed you entirely dry. You really thought you won last night. But you forgot that I am a senior banker. I know exactly how to move money, and I know exactly how to completely ruin a person." I looked down at the white piece of paper resting on the mahogany table. I stared at the bold black ink spelling out the complete financial betrayal of my son. I saw David's familiar signature scrawled hurriedly at the bottom of the page. It was their ultimate trump card designed to completely erase my victory and hand them $5 million of untraceable cash. Sylvia and Trent watched me eagerly, waiting for the devastating realization to finally break my spirit. They expected me to scream or cry or accuse them of lying. Instead, I slowly reached into my bag and pulled out my digital tablet. I placed my hand on the smooth glass screen of my digital tablet, just as the heavy doors of the conference room violently swung open. Nadine stormed into the room. She looked absolutely nothing like the polished high society billionaire from the night before. Her designer dress was severely wrinkled, and her hair was an absolute mess. The dark circles under her eyes proved she spent the entire long night sitting inside a federal interrogation room. She had likely just been released on a temporary cash bond. But despite facing total financial and legal ruin, Nadine still carried her incredibly toxic arrogance. She slammed her expensive leather handbag onto the table and pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my face. She was absolutely desperate for cash after the federal raid, and this forged will was her only remaining lifeline. "You are not going to get away with this, Natalie," she hissed, her voice completely raw from screaming at federal agents all night. "Trent called me this morning and told me all about David's updated will. I knew my brother would never ever leave his entire fortune to a pathetic parasite like you. He finally saw you for what you truly are, a complete and total failure." Nadine paced back and forth behind Trent's chair, using his physical presence as a shield. "You spent the last 8 years pretending to be the perfect little housewife," she continued, her tone dripping with venom. "But we all knew the real truth. You were completely suffocating David. You dragged him down with your pathetic clearance rack lifestyle and your constant annoying whining. He was utterly miserable living with you. That is exactly why he completely cut you out of his life insurance policy. He wanted to make absolutely sure his money went to the smart people who actually know exactly how to manage wealth. He gave it to Trent because Trent is the true financial genius of this entire family. Trent knows how to actively protect capital. You, on the other hand, cannot even protect your very own son. You are an entirely unfit mother, Natalie. You are emotionally unstable, and you are definitely going to traumatize Leo with your delusions. We are not just taking the insurance money today. We are going to immediately petition the family court to take full legal custody of Leo. Trent and I can provide him with a real stable home and the elite private education he actually deserves. You will be permanently removed from his life." The sheer audacity of her gaslighting was physically dizzying. Nadine was currently under federal investigation for tax evasion, yet she was standing in a legal office lecturing me about financial responsibility. She was threatening to take my child simply because she desperately needed to secure her cut of the money to pay her mounting legal fees. Sylvia nodded in agreement, crossing her arms tightly. "Nadine is right," Sylvia chimed in, offering a cold smile. "You have no home, Natalie. The foreclosure you bought last night means nothing when we bleed you dry in civil court. You have no real family. You are a completely unstable woman who needs psychiatric help. No judge in this state would ever let a wealthy bank manager like Trent lose a custody battle to a deranged widow. Just give up right now. Hand over the rights to the firm, drop the foreclosure, and walk away quietly. If you do exactly as we say, we might let you see Leo on the weekends. But if you try to fight us, we will make sure you never see your son again." Trent leaned forward, resting his chin on his manicured hands. He looked like a king, convinced that his victory was completely guaranteed. "You heard them," Natalie, Trent said, his voice incredibly threatening. "We hold all the cards now. We have the legal will, we have the financial power, and we have the family legacy. You are nothing but a temporary mistake David made when he was young. He finally fixed that mistake right before he died. So do yourself a favor and just surrender. Do not make this any uglier than it already is, because I promise you that I will not stop until you are completely broken. I will take the money, I will take the boy, and I will leave you with absolutely nothing." "Mr. Caldwell." The family attorney sat quietly, adjusting his glasses. He looked nervous, sensing the sheer hostility radiating across the room, but he said nothing to stop the relentless psychological abuse. They all stared at me, waiting for the tearful surrender they had orchestrated. They wanted me to break down and beg for their mercy, but I did not shed a single tear. I just looked right back at them. I looked right back at them and let the silence stretch. They were incredibly certain of their victory. They built this entire narrative where I was just a naive housewife who stumbled into their wealthy family by pure luck. Nadine thought I spent my days clipping coupons. Trent thought I was financially illiterate. Sylvia believed I was a parasite. They were all wrong. I did not cry over the document resting on the table. I did not scream that it was unfair. I simply picked up my digital tablet from my lap and powered it on. "What are you doing?" Nadine snapped, her eyes narrowing. "Are you deaf? Did you not hear us? You have lost." I ignored her completely. I tapped the screen, entering my secure passcode. "You have all made massive assumptions about me over the past 8 years," I said, my voice completely calm. "You assumed because I wore simple clothes and drove an ordinary car I was broke. You assumed because I stayed quiet during family dinners I was stupid. But the biggest mistake you made was assuming you knew what I did for a living." Trent rolled his eyes, letting out a loud scoff. "We know exactly what you did," he mocked, leaning back. "You were a low-level data entry clerk. You sat in a cubicle and typed numbers into a spreadsheet until my brother rescued you." I looked directly at Trent and offered him a chilling smile. "I was never a data clerk, Trent. I am a forensic accountant. And not just a standard bookkeeper. I am a highly specialized senior forensic auditor holding federal clearance. My exact area of expertise is hunting down corporate embezzlement, tracking hidden offshore assets, and destroying white-collar criminals. I track the money that people like you desperately try to hide." The smug look on Trent's face vanished. Sylvia sat up straight, clutching her pearls. Nadine blinked in rapid confusion, unable to process my words. Mr. Caldwell suddenly looked incredibly pale. I tapped the casting icon on my tablet. A loud electronic chime echoed as my device instantly synced to the digital projector mounted above Mr. Caldwell's head. The blank screen behind him flickered to life, illuminating the conference room with a bright, glaring light. "What is she doing?" Trent demanded, sitting forward. "Caldwell, turn that projector off right now. She does not have the floor." Mr. Caldwell frantically fumbled for the remote, but Harrison Croft reached across the table and placed his heavy hand firmly over the attorney's wrist. "I highly suggest you let my client finish her presentation, Caldwell." Harrison warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Unless you want your law firm deeply implicated in a federal conspiracy." Caldwell froze, pulling his hand away and shrinking back into his leather chair. I looked up at the massive, glowing screen. I had uploaded a high-resolution scan of the exact updated will they just presented. The document loomed over the room, towering above Sylvia and Trent like a massive digital guillotine. "You claim David signed this document exactly 4 weeks before he died," I said, projecting my voice clearly. "You claimed he came to you in secret to protect his money. You really thought handing me a piece of paper with black ink would make me run away terrified. But you forgot who you were dealing with." I placed my fingers on the screen of my tablet and physically pinched outward, zooming in drastically on the bottom right corner of the digital document. The screen behind Caldwell magnified the image until David's supposed signature was easily 10 feet wide, dominating the entire wall. Every single stroke of the pen, every curve and drop of ink, was exposed in microscopic detail. "Let us look closely at my late husband's signature," I instructed, stepping away from the table and walking directly toward the projection. To the untrained eye, this looks like a decent forgery. It has his standard loop on the capital letter and the sharp, aggressive angle on the final stroke. If you handed this to a low-level bank teller, they might accept it. But when a forensic accountant looks at a signature, we do not just look at the shape of the letters. We look at the biometric pressure. We look at the digital metadata of the paper itself. And we look for the exact signs of a terrified man trying to steal $5 million. I pointed my right index finger directly at the giant projected image. The entire room fell into an absolute dead silence. Nadine instantly stopped breathing. Sylvia looked absolutely terrified. And Trent, the supposed financial genius of the family, suddenly began to sweat profusely. He knew exactly what I was now about to reveal to the entire world here today. Take a close look at the lower loop of the letter D I instructed, pointing at the massive projection. When my husband signed his name, he wrote with a fast, fluid motion. But if you look at this microscopic ink distribution here, you will see heavy pooling at the bottom curves and tiny jagged hesitation marks. This is called a drawn signature. The person who wrote this was not signing their own name. They were slowly and carefully tracing it from another document. Trent swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "You are just making things up to save yourself," he stammered, his voice lacking its previous booming confidence. "That is his signature. The document is dated 4 weeks before he died. It is legally binding. The physical date written on a piece of paper means absolutely nothing to a forensic auditor." "Trent," I replied, pulling up a new window on my tablet. "Because criminals always lie, but digital metadata never does." I tapped the screen again, and the giant image of the will was replaced by a dense wall of complex computer code and network routing logs. Mr. Caldwell squinted at the screen, his legal mind completely unequipped to understand the digital trap closing around him. "What you are looking at is the hidden digital fingerprint of this exact document," I explained, pacing slowly across the front of the room. "Every modern printer and word processing software embeds microscopic tracking data into every single page it produces." When Mr. Caldwell handed me this will, I did not just read the words. I ran a high-speed forensic scan of the paper using my tablet camera. I extracted the hidden steganographic dots printed across the background. Nadine looked completely lost, but the absolute terror on Trent's face confirmed he knew exactly what I was talking about. This document was not typed or printed 4 weeks before David died. I announced, my voice echoing with absolute authority. The embedded metadata proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that this specific file was created, saved, and printed exactly 3 days after my husband was pronounced dead. Sylvia let out a sharp gasp, gripping the edge of the mahogany table. "That is a lie," she shrieked, looking frantically at her older son. "Trent, tell her she is lying." Trent could not even open his mouth. He was staring at the glowing code on the wall like a man watching his own execution. But the metadata does not just tell us when the document was created. I continued swiping my finger across the tablet to highlight a specific string of numbers in bright red. It tells us exactly where it was born. This is an IP address. It is the unique digital location of the network that generated the file. I ran a quick cross-reference on this specific IP address before we walked into this meeting today. Do you want to guess who owns this network, Trent? The silence in the room was deafening. Even Nadine was staring at her husband now, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. "This IP address belongs to the secure internal network of the downtown commercial bank branch," I said, locking eyes with my terrified brother-in-law. "Specifically, it is registered to the private executive office on the top floor. Your office." "Trent, the metadata also identifies the exact machine that printed this forgery. A Lexmark Enterprise printer serial number ending in 482. The exact printer sitting right next to your expensive mahogany desk." I let the heavy absolute truth settle over the room. The grand illusion of the perfect wealthy family was crumbling into digital dust right in front of their eyes. "You did not have a secret meeting with my husband," I said coldly. "You panicked when you realized his life insurance payout was the only way to save yourself from absolute financial ruin. So 3 days after he died, you sat in your banking office and forged a fake will. You thought I would accept it. You committed federal fraud, and you left a digital trail leading right back to your own desk." Mr. Caldwell pushed his chair back. He threw his pen down on the table, holding his hands up in the air. "I had absolutely no knowledge of this," Caldwell shouted, his voice trembling with fear. "I was told this was a legitimate document found in his personal safe. My firm will not be party to federal forgery." "Sit down," Caldwell Harrison barked, his voice slamming into the attorney like a physical blow. My client is not finished. I turned back to my tablet. Exposing the forged will was just the warm-up. Now it was time to reveal exactly why Trent was so desperate for that $5 million. I turned my back on the terrified attorney and tapped the screen of my tablet one more time. The massive projection on the wall instantly shifted. The forged will vanished and was replaced by a dizzying labyrinth of financial spreadsheets, red highlighted bank routing numbers, and complex corporate flowcharts. It looked like the chaotic digital web of a massive organized crime syndicate. I stepped away from the projector and walked slowly toward the mahogany table, stopping directly across from my brother-in-law. You do not risk 30 years in federal prison for forgery just because you are greedy, I said, my voice echoing with absolute clarity in the quiet conference room. A senior regional bank director only commits such a sloppy, desperate crime when he is completely out of options. You needed that $5 million insurance payout immediately, not to buy a new yacht or a vacation home, but to cover up a massive radioactive financial crater before the federal banking regulators found it. Trent pressed his back hard against his leather chair. He looked like a man who had just been backed to the edge of a massive cliff. Sylvia watched the screen with wide, uncomprehending eyes while Nadine stared at the complex web of red lines connecting various bank accounts. For the past 3 years, you have been abusing your top-tier executive clearance. I continued, pointing at the left side of the glowing projection. It started incredibly small. You authorized quiet internal wire transfers, moving cash out of my late husband's private investment accounts. David trusted you completely. He let you manage his personal wealth portfolio because you were his older brother. You exploited that absolute trust. You set up a series of phantom shell accounts and routed his money through them to completely scrub the digital trail and bypass the internal bank audits. I swiped my finger across the tablet, bringing a specific set of highlighted banking records to the absolute center of the giant screen. But my husband was an incredibly smart man. He started asking you very difficult questions about missing dividends and unexplained account drains. You panicked. You knew you could not keep bleeding his primary accounts without him launching a formal inquiry, so you pivoted to a target you thought would never be closely monitored. I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch. I looked at Sylvia, who was beginning to hyperventilate. Then I looked at Trent, who had completely stopped breathing. You drained Leo's college fund, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, furious whisper. You used your administrative override to systematically siphon away the future of your 8-year-old nephew. Over the span of 18 months, you stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from a child. You took the money David worked his entire life to secure for his son, and you wiped it out completely. Nadine let out a loud, dramatic gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. Even she, with all her boundless cruelty and arrogance, looked absolutely horrified by the sheer depth of her husband's depravity. Stealing from a grieving widow was one thing, but stealing a child's education fund was a completely different level of evil. But why? Nadine demanded, her voice cracking sharply. Trent makes a massive corporate salary. We have plenty of money. Why would you ever need to steal from Leo's college account? I turned my gaze directly to Nadine. I offered her a look of pure, unadulterated pity. You really do not see it, do you, Nadine? I asked softly. I tapped my tablet, bringing the final piece of the digital puzzle into the light. The red lines on the screen converged, moving from Leo's depleted accounts directly into a single massive corporate holding account. The logo of Nadine's luxury boutique franchise flashed brightly on the wall. He stole the money to bail you out, I explained, my voice cutting through her remaining delusions like a surgical knife. Your incredible luxury business has not turned a single cent of actual profit in over 4 years. You were completely drowning in high-interest debt and vendor lawsuits. If you went publicly bankrupt, it would have destroyed Trent's elite social standing and triggered a full review of his personal finances by the bank board. So he kept your pathetic vanity projects secretly afloat by injecting it with stolen cash. He embezzled from his brother's child so you could pretend you were a billionaire. Nadine staggered backward, her expensive high heels catching on the carpet. She looked at her husband with pure, absolute, violent disgust. Trent sat completely frozen, staring blankly at the polished mahogany conference table. The entire grand illusion of their perfect wealthy life was completely shattered forever, leaving them with absolutely nothing but undeniable theft and impending federal crimes. Trent stared at the massive glowing projection on the wall, his eyes wide and bloodshot. His massive corporate and personal execution was finally undeniable. He spent his life building the facade of the wealthy, untouchable banking executive. Now the grand illusion was shattered. His prestigious career at the commercial bank was instantly over. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and the blatant forgery of a legal document. He slowly turned his head to look at his wife. Nadine was backing away from him, her face twisted in pure revulsion. Sylvia, his mother, was staring at him with deep horror. The crushing weight of his absolute ruin snapped the last thread of his sanity. A low, guttural roar built in his throat. "You ruined my life!" Trent screamed, his face turning a violent purple. He slammed both hands onto the polished mahogany conference table and launched his body forward. He lunged across the wide table, scattering Mr. Caldwell's legal folders. His expensive tailored suit jacket ripped at the seams as he reached out with clawed hands, aiming right for my throat. I did not flinch or take a step back. Harrison Croft moved with terrifying speed. The Wall Street lawyer stepped directly in front of me, intercepting Trent mid-air. Harrison grabbed Trent by his ripped lapels and shoved him backward. Trent crashed hard into Mr. Caldwell's heavy leather executive chair, sending the older attorney scrambling backward in sheer panic. Fueled by raw adrenaline and blinding rage, Trent scrambled to his feet, kicking the heavy chair out of his way to charge a second time. "I will kill you, Natalie!" he roared, spit flying from his lips. Before he could take another step, the heavy double doors of the conference room burst open. The thick wood slammed loudly against the glass walls, causing the room to shake. "Freeze right there!" A loud, commanding voice boomed over the chaos. 4 heavily armed, uniformed police officers rushed into the room. Their heavy boots pounded the carpet as they zeroed in on the active threat. Trent was blinded by his rage and refused to comply. He raised his fists, turning aggressively toward the officers. That was his final massive mistake. 2 large officers tackled Trent simultaneously, grabbing his arms and driving his chest hard into the floor. The heavy impact knocked the wind out of his lungs. He gasped wildly as they pinned his arms behind his back. "Stop resisting," one officer ordered, pressing his knee between Trent's shoulder blades. Nadine pressed herself flat against the far wall, screaming hysterically as she watched her husband subdued. Trent thrashed against the carpet but was completely trapped. The physical threat was neutralized. The room fell into a chaotic silence, broken only by Trent's desperate panting. We all stood frozen, watching the officers secure the handcuffs tightly around Trent's wrists. I assumed the police had arrived to arrest Trent for his violent outburst, or the massive banking fraud I had just thoroughly exposed. But the situation was about to take a completely different, sinister turn. A 5th man walked slowly into the conference room. He was not wearing a uniform. He wore a rumpled gray suit and carried a thick manila folder. He possessed the exhausted demeanor of a man who dealt exclusively with absolute human misery. The lead detective stopped scanning the room with sharp, observant eyes. He looked down at Trent, who was pinned against the floor. The detective did not say a single word to my brother-in-law. He did not read him his rights or formally place him under arrest for the embezzlement. Instead, the lead detective completely ignored Trent and walked right past him. He continued walking slowly around the large mahogany table, his heavy shoes clicking deliberately. He stopped directly in front of Sylvia. My mother-in-law froze her eyes, darting nervously toward the heavy gold badge resting on his hip. "Sylvia," the detective said, his voice carrying absolute authority, "please stand up and place your hands flat on the table where I can see them." Sylvia opened her mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. She pushed herself up from the chair, her hands trembling violently as she placed them on the mahogany wood. The detective unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The sharp metallic clicking sound echoed loudly in the stunned room. Sylvia, you are officially under arrest, the detective announced, snapping the cold steel firmly around her wrist. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. The room stood in absolute paralyzed shock as the mother-in-law was handcuffed. Why was Sylvia being arrested? Sylvia stared at the cold steel rings locked securely around her wrists. The expensive pearls around her neck trembled as she let out a high-pitched gasp of pure disbelief. "What is the meaning of this?" she stammered, looking wildly from the detective to Trent, who was still pinned to the carpet. "I am a grieving mother. You cannot come into my lawyer's office and arrest me for absolutely nothing." The lead detective did not flinch at her desperate outrage. He reached into his rumpled gray suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of thick white paper, holding it up for everyone to see. "This is a federal warrant for your immediate arrest, Sylvia," he stated, his voice echoing with absolute unwavering authority. "You are being formally charged with first-degree insurance fraud and criminal conspiracy." "Insurance fraud?" Sylvia shrieked, her face turning pale white. "I have never committed a crime in my entire life. I do not even handle my own finances. My son handles everything for me." She pointed her cuffed hands down at Trent, desperately trying to throw her own child under the bus to save herself. But the detective slowly shook his head. "Trent will be facing his own extensive list of massive federal charges today," the detective replied, his tone completely flat. "But this specific warrant has absolutely nothing to do with the commercial bank embezzlement or the forged legal will. This warrant is for your direct involvement in the horrifying events leading up to your son's fatal car crash." The terrifying word crash hung heavily in the air like a massive physical weight. Nadine let out a loud, horrified sob, backing away slowly until her shoulders hit the cold glass wall of the conference room. Trent stopped struggling against the heavy police officers entirely, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror. I stepped forward, walking slowly past Mr. Caldwell, who was sitting completely frozen in his leather chair. "You really thought I spent the last entire month just sitting alone in a dark room, crying over my dead husband? Did you not?" "Sylvia," I asked, my voice dangerously low and steady. "You thought I was weak and completely distracted by my grief. But while you were busy planning luxurious funeral receptions and forging fake legal documents, I was doing exactly what I do best. I was aggressively tracking the money." Sylvia squeezed her eyes shut tight, shaking her head in violent, absolute denial. "I do not know what you are talking about," she whispered, her voice cracking pathetically. I picked up my digital tablet from the mahogany table and swiped the glowing screen. The projector behind the attorney flashed brightly, bringing up a highly classified bank statement. This financial statement was not from Trent's commercial bank branch. It was from a heavily encrypted offshore account registered under a fake shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. "David did not die in a tragic, unexpected accident," I said, my voice breaking slightly before hardening back into absolute steel. "The police report stated his brakes failed on a steep mountain road, calling it a mechanical malfunction. But senior forensic accountants know that sudden catastrophic malfunctions are almost always bought and paid for in hard cash." I pointed my finger directly at a specific red line item on the projected offshore statement. "Exactly 4 days before David's car went off that steep cliff, you authorized a highly secure wire transfer from this hidden offshore account. You moved exactly $20,000 in untraceable liquid funds. You routed the money through 3 dummy corporations to wash the digital trail, but you made one massive mistake. You underestimated my ability to unravel digital laundry." The room was dead silent except for the heavy rhythmic breathing of the police officers holding Trent firmly down on the floor. "I tracked every single cent of that $20,000. I continued, stepping into Sylvia's personal space. "I followed your hidden digital breadcrumbs all the way to a small cash-only auto body shop located just outside the city limits. The shop is owned by a mechanic with a long, violent criminal record. The exact same shady mechanic who mysteriously offered to give David's car a free tune-up less than a week before the fatal crash." Sylvia's knees violently buckled under her weight. If the lead detective had not grabbed her arm, she would have collapsed completely onto the carpet. You knew Trent faced imminent federal prison for embezzling millions to save Nadine's failing boutique, I said. You knew the bank auditors were closing in fast. You desperately needed David's $5 million life insurance policy to replace the stolen funds and save your golden child. But David was perfectly healthy, so you expedited the insurance payout. You paid a violent criminal $20,000 to cut the brake lines on your own son's car. The heavy absolute truth hung in the conference room like a suffocating cloud of toxic smoke. You paid a violent criminal $20,000 to cut the brake lines on your own son's car. My words echoed off the glass walls, leaving a terrifying ringing in the ears of everyone present. Sylvia violently shook her head, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place. No, she whimpered, her voice barely a whisper as she slumped against the polished mahogany table. I am a mother. I would never ever hurt my own child. You are framing me. You planted those fake bank records to destroy our family. I stepped closer to her, ignoring the lead detective who was holding her firmly by her cuffed wrists. Do not insult my intelligence, Sylvia, I said, my voice ice cold. And do not ever dare to call yourself a mother. A real mother protects her children from the monsters in the dark. She does not become the monster. I turned back to the digital projector and swiped my tablet to the next slide. A highly confidential internal banking memo appeared on the massive screen. It was stamped with the bright red official seal of the Federal Reserve. Exactly 2 weeks before David died, this formal notice of a surprise federal audit was delivered directly to Trent's commercial bank branch, I explained, pointing at the glaring red dates on the screen. The federal banking regulators had detected massive financial irregularities in the commercial loan department. They were coming to aggressively tear through the books. They were coming to look for the exact millions of dollars Trent had illegally embezzled to keep Nadine's failing boutiques afloat. Trent let out a pathetic muffled groan from the floor, his face buried deep in the carpet. He knew the absolute end of his life had finally arrived. When Trent received this audit notice, he panicked. I continued pacing slowly in front of the projection. He went straight to you, Sylvia. He sat in your luxurious mansion and cried like a terrified little boy because he knew he was facing decades in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate fraud. The two of you quickly realized that the only possible way to save his prestigious career and keep Nadine out of prison was to completely replace the stolen millions before the federal auditors arrived. But your massive estate was already heavily mortgaged, and Nadine's business was completely bankrupt. You had absolutely no liquid capital left. I paused, letting my eyes drift over to Trent, then to Nadine, and finally resting on Sylvia. But you knew David had a $5 million life insurance policy, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, furious whisper. You knew that $5 million in pure untraceable cash was the exact amount you desperately needed to secretly plug the massive financial crater Trent had dug. There was only one problem. David was perfectly healthy. He was young and strong, and he had a beautiful 8-year-old son to live for. Nadine slid down the glass walls, slowly sinking to the floor. She wrapped her arms tightly around her knees, rocking back and forth as the horrifying reality of what her husband and mother-in-law had done completely washed over her. Even she, the incredibly cruel, arrogant woman who had openly mocked me at a funeral, could not stomach the sheer magnitude of this ultimate betrayal. So you made a choice, Sylvia, I said, my voice echoing with pure, unfiltered rage. You sat in your beautiful mansion and you weighed the lives of your 2 sons. You looked at Trent, your golden child, the prestigious bank manager who gave you access to the elite country club lifestyle. Then you looked at David, the quiet, hardworking son who never cared about your shallow, high society games. And you chose to sacrifice David. You decided his life was worth exactly $5 million to save Trent's pathetic career. Sylvia began to sob uncontrollably, the heavy steel handcuffs clinking loudly against the mahogany table as her whole body shook. It was an accident, she wailed hysterically, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. The mechanic was only supposed to damage the engine. He was only supposed to cause a minor crash, so David would end up in the hospital. We just wanted to claim the medical insurance payout to buy some time. We never wanted him to die. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mr. Caldwell, the family attorney, turned physically green, looking like he was about to be sick right on his expensive leather chair. Sylvia had just openly confessed to the entire conspiracy in front of a federal detective, 4 police officers, and her own legal counsel. The lead detective tightened his iron grip on her arm, his face completely devoid of any sympathy. "Mrs. Sylvia, we have already raided the auto body shop. We arrested the mechanic at 6 o'clock this morning. He fully confessed to everything. He showed us the encrypted text messages you sent him demanding that the brake lines be completely severed. He provided us with the offshore wire routing numbers that perfectly matched the forensic data your daughter-in-law just presented. You did not ask for a minor accident. You explicitly paid for a fatal crash." Sylvia let out a blood-curdling scream of pure absolute agony, realizing her desperate lies were completely useless. Her legs finally gave out entirely, and the detective had to physically hold her up by her arms to keep her from collapsing into a pathetic heap on the floor. I looked down at Trent, who had completely stopped moving. He lay perfectly still on the carpet, surrounded by police officers, violently trembling, as the absolute horror of his actions consumed his mind. He had allowed his own brother to be slaughtered like a sacrificial lamb just to protect his banking job and his superficial marriage to Nadine. The grand illusion of their powerful, untouchable family legacy was not just broken, it was drenched in innocent blood. Nadine remained slumped against the cold glass wall of the conference room. Her entire body was shaking so violently that her expensive designer heels rattled against the floorboards. For years, she had happily played the role of the vicious elitist who gleefully looked down on me. She had gladly spent the millions of dollars Trent embezzled, and she had fully supported their cruel campaign to leave me penniless. But murder was an entirely different reality. The realization that her failing fashion boutiques were the direct motive for a brutal assassination completely shattered her arrogant facade. She looked at Trent, who was pinned to the carpet, and then at Sylvia, who was sobbing uncontrollably in handcuffs. Nadine knew that the federal government was going to build a massive conspiracy case, and her name was right in the middle of the financial motive. Self-preservation is a terrifying instinct. Nadine scrambled frantically to her feet, pushing herself away from the glass. She raised both of her hands high in the air, looking directly at the lead detective. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this!" she screamed, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "I did not know anything about the breaks. I swear to you, I never wanted David dead. They did this. They are the murderers, not me." "Shut your mouth!" Nadine Trent roared from the floor, struggling violently against the heavy knees of the police officers. "Do not say another word to them. We need to call our lawyers right now." But Nadine was far beyond the reach of legal strategy. She was a cornered rat desperate to strike a deal, and she knew the only way to avoid a murder charge was to completely annihilate her own husband. "I will tell you everything," Nadine shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly down at Trent. "You want to know about the embezzlement. He did not just steal from his brother and nephew. He has been running a massive kickback scheme at the bank for the last 5 years. He approves high-risk commercial loans for desperate developers and forces them to pay him a 20% cash bribe under the table. That is how we afforded the down payment on our new penthouse. He keeps all the physical ledger books locked in a hidden biometric safe behind the mirror in our master bathroom. He has 3 burner phones buried in the bottom drawer of his office desk." Trent let out an agonizing scream of pure rage, spitting onto the carpet. "You treacherous parasite," he yelled, his face contorted in absolute hatred. "I destroyed my entire career to save you from bankruptcy. I committed fraud to buy you the luxurious life you constantly begged for. You are nothing without me. You are just a pathetic gold digger who cannot even run a simple clothing store. You murdered your own brother." Nadine shrieked back, pacing frantically around the table. "Do not try to blame your pathetic insecurities on me. You are a weak coward, Trent. You have always been a coward." Nadine then whipped her head around and locked her terrifying, frantic gaze onto Sylvia. My mother-in-law recoiled, leaning away from the raging woman she had once proudly called her favorite daughter. Nadine was not going to let Sylvia play the victim. "And do not even get me started on this wicked old witch," Nadine yelled, pointing right at Sylvia's tear-stained face. "She is not just a murderer. She has been committing massive tax fraud for 2 decades. You want to know how she funds her elite country club lifestyle? She runs a fake charitable foundation for underprivileged children. She hosts those massive million-dollar galas, collects all the donations from her rich idiot friends, and immediately funnels 80% of the cash directly into her personal offshore accounts. She has over $2 million in undeclared blood diamond jewelry stashed in a private vault at a Swiss bank." Sylvia's mouth dropped open in pure, unadulterated horror. "You ungrateful little harlot!" Sylvia shrieked, straining against the heavy steel handcuffs. "I welcomed you into my home. I treated you like my own flesh and blood. You ate my food, drank my wine, and spent my money, and now you dare to stand there and lie to the police to save your own miserable skin." "I am not lying, and you know it," Nadine spat back, stepping so close to Sylvia that the detective had to step between them. "Tell them about the art collection, Sylvia. Tell them how you systematically stole all the antique paintings from your own dying husband's estate before the probate court could inventory them. You are a thief and a murderer, and I hope you rot in a federal cell for the rest of your miserable life." The grand conference room descended into absolute chaos. The wealthy, untouchable family that had terrorized me for 8 long years was violently tearing itself apart. Trent was screaming vile curses at his wife from the floor. Sylvia was sobbing and spitting venom back at Nadine, calling her a worthless traitor. Nadine was crying hysterically, begging the lead detective for a federal immunity deal in exchange for her full cooperation. The lead detective simply stood there, pulling a small notebook from his pocket and calmly writing down every single confession spilling from their mouths. I stood quietly near the digital projector, watching the beautiful destruction of their toxic empire. They did not need me to destroy them anymore. Their own boundless greed, crushing paranoia, and deep-rooted selfishness had finally caused a spectacular implosion. They were executing each other right in front of my eyes. 3 exact weeks passed since the explosive confrontation inside the mahogany conference room. For 21 agonizing days, Trent and Sylvia sat locked inside separate concrete federal holding cells. Their designer clothes were replaced by orange jumpsuits, and their extravagant meals were reduced to cold cafeteria trays. The crushing reality of federal prison was breaking their arrogant spirits. But high society criminals rarely go down without deploying their incredibly expensive defense attorneys. Sylvia had retained the services of a ruthless defense lawyer named Donovan Pierce. Donovan charged exorbitant hourly rates because he specialized entirely in finding legal technicalities for guilty billionaires. On the morning of their 22nd day in custody, Donovan managed to execute a highly controversial legal maneuver. During a closed-door emergency hearing, he successfully argued a jurisdictional overlap between the state homicide investigation and the federal raid. He claimed the lead detective had committed a procedural error by formally arresting Sylvia for a state-level conspiracy charge while operating under the umbrella of a federal banking raid without the proper Joint Task Force documentation. It was a flimsy legal loophole, but it was just enough to cast reasonable doubt on the initial chain of custody. The federal judge, visibly disgusted by the technicality, had absolutely no choice but to temporarily grant them bail pending the massive federal trial. But freedom came with a devastating price. Donovan secured their release by completely draining a highly secretive emergency trust fund Sylvia had buried under her maiden name decades ago. When Trent and Sylvia finally walked out of the federal courthouse that afternoon, there were no sleek black luxury cars waiting for them. Instead, they were instantly swarmed by a vicious mob of reporters and aggressive paparazzi. The horrific news of their arrest had leaked entirely to the public. The absolute scandalous story of a wealthy elite banking family murdering their own son for insurance money dominated every single major news network in the country. Trent shielded his face with a manila folder as angry protesters shouted vile insults at them from behind the police barricades. They managed to escape the media circus by cramming themselves into a cheap-smelling city taxi. For the first time in their entire privileged lives, they had absolutely nowhere to go. My private equity firm, ND Holdings, had officially taken full physical possession of the grand estate. The heavy iron gates of the mansion were locked tight by federal marshals and guarded by private security. Trent could not go back to his luxury penthouse because Nadine had already filed for an expedited divorce and completely changed the locks. Nadine was currently living under federal protection, singing like a bird to the investigators to save herself from prison. The former regional bank director and the elite high society matriarch were forced to rent a dingy, incredibly depressing two-room motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. Their bank accounts remained entirely frozen. Their platinum credit cards were permanently canceled. The commercial bank had not only fired Trent, but they had also publicly released a scathing corporate statement completely disavowing any knowledge of his massive embezzlement ring. Sylvia attempted to call her wealthy country club friends, begging them for temporary loans or a place to stay. Every single person hung up the phone the second they heard her voice. They were absolute social pariahs. They had become the exact type of destitute, penniless trash they had accused me of being for 8 long years. Sitting on the edge of a stained motel mattress, staring at a flickering television screen, Trent finally began to fully panic. He paced the small, dirty room, running his hands frantically through his unwashed hair. "We are going to die in a federal penitentiary, Mother," Trent hyperventilated, his voice shaking with pure, unadulterated terror. "The trial starts in exactly 2 months. Nadine is giving them the physical ledgers. The mechanic already fully confessed. Donovan told me this morning that the absolute best plea deal we can hope for is 40 years without the possibility of parole. We have absolutely no money left to pay him. We are completely finished." Sylvia stared blankly at the peeling wallpaper of the cheap motel room, her mind completely broken by the sudden violent drop from the absolute pinnacle of wealth to the dirty floor of a roadside inn. Refused to accept reality. She slowly turned her head to look at her terrified son. The cold, calculating light of pure elite arrogance flickered back into her eyes. "We are not finished, Trent," Sylvia whispered, her voice hardening into absolute desperate determination. "We just need enough liquid cash to pay off a private pilot and disappear to a non-extradition country before the trial officially starts. I still have one incredibly massive card left to play." Sylvia turned away from the peeling wallpaper and looked at her terrified son. "I still have the annual Children's Foundation gala," she said, her voice devoid of its usual elegance. "It is scheduled for this coming Saturday at the Grand Ballroom. The venue was paid for 6 months ago. The invitations were sent out long before this nightmare happened. Hundreds of wealthy investors and socialites are planning to attend." Trent shook his head, rubbing his temples frantically. "Are you insane, Mother?" he hissed, his voice cracking. "We are out on federal bail for conspiracy to commit murder and corporate embezzlement. Nobody is going to show up to a charity event hosted by us. Half the city wants us locked in a steel cage. They will show up precisely because they are morbidly curious." Sylvia snapped, her eyes wide and manic. "The elite feed on absolute scandal, Trent. They will come to see the train wreck in person. When they fill that ballroom, we are going to get up on that stage and sell them the performance of a lifetime. We will declare that your sister-in-law suffered a psychotic break after David died. We will claim she hired hackers to manipulate the metadata and plant those wire transfers to steal our estate. We will tell everyone we are the tragic victims of a deranged gold digger." Trent slowly stopped pacing the carpet. A desperate glimmer of hope flickered in his bloodshot eyes. "If we can convince even a dozen of those investors that we are innocent, they might write massive checks to the foundation out of pure sympathy," Trent whispered, piecing the plan together. "And since the foundation accounts are completely separate from our frozen assets, we can immediately drain the cash." "Exactly," Sylvia said, grabbing his shoulders tightly. "We take the donation money, we pay the private pilot waiting at the airstrip, and we completely vanish to a country without extradition treaties." but we have to utterly destroy her reputation on that stage tonight to make it work. Fast forward to Saturday night. The grand ballroom of the hotel was glowing brightly with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with expensive floral arrangements. Just as Sylvia predicted, the morbid curiosity of the elite high society drew a massive crowd. Over 300 wealthy guests filed into the venue wearing custom tuxedos and glittering designer gowns. They whispered furiously behind their champagne flutes, pointing at Sylvia and Trent, who were standing nervously near the main stage. Sylvia had spent her absolute last remaining dollars hiring a cheap makeup artist to heavily powder her face, trying desperately to hide the dark, exhausted circles under her eyes. She wore a vintage black gown she had miraculously managed to smuggle out of the mansion before the federal marshals locked it down tight. Trent stood incredibly stiffly beside her, wearing a borrowed suit that did not quite fit his frame. He was nervously scanning the crowded room, desperately calculating exactly how much money they could quickly extract from the room full of gullible millionaires. They had aggressively hired a small independent production crew to heavily live-stream the entire charity gala directly onto the foundation website. Sylvia wanted to make absolutely sure her tragic victim narrative reached the widest possible audience. She wanted the entire city to fundamentally believe that I was a completely insane hacker who had maliciously orchestrated a massive federal hoax to steal her family wealth. Outside the luxurious hotel, the cold winter night air whipped aggressively through the empty city streets. I sat completely quietly in the back seat of a heavily tinted black SUV parked directly across from the grand ballroom entrance. Harrison Croft sat in the leather seat right next to me, his thick leather briefcase resting heavily on his lap. The bright glow of my digital tablet illuminated the dark interior of the secure vehicle. I was watching the high-definition live stream of the gala. The camera panned across the crowded ballroom, capturing the oblivious wealthy investors taking their seats at the expensive catered tables. I watched Trent repeatedly tap the microphone, checking the audio levels. I watched Sylvia practice her fake tragic smile, constantly adjusting the heavy string of pearls she still stubbornly refused to take off. They were completely ready to lie to the entire world one last time. They were absolutely convinced they could successfully spin their vicious web of deceit, secure the untraceable cash, and fly away completely unpunished. I reached down and gently locked the glowing screen of my digital tablet. I looked out the dark-tinted window at the brightly glowing entrance of the expensive hotel. Then I slowly turned to my lawyer. "Harrison," I said, my voice completely calm and utterly merciless. "Let us give them the finale they deserve." Inside the grand ballroom of the hotel, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive catered food and the quiet murmur of high society gossip. 300 of the wealthiest investors, politicians, and socialites in the city sat around circular tables draped in white silk. The crystal chandeliers above cast a warm golden light over the room, hiding the dark, horrific reality of the two people hosting the event. Heavy television cameras were positioned at the back of the room, feeding a high-definition live stream directly to the foundation website. Everyone in the room was morbidly fascinated by the massive scandal surrounding the family. They had all seen the news reports of the federal raid and the murder conspiracy charges, but they came tonight because they wanted to hear the disgraced matriarch speak for herself. The low chatter in the ballroom immediately died down as Sylvia slowly walked up the carpeted steps to the main stage. She leaned heavily on the wooden podium, gripping the edges with trembling hands. She had masterfully styled herself to look like the ultimate tragic victim. Her vintage black dress hung slightly loose on her frame, and her face was heavily powdered to look sickly and exhausted. Trent stood respectfully a few feet behind her, wearing a solemn expression that completely masked his desperate greed. Sylvia looked out over the massive crowd and let out a long, shaky sigh directly into the microphone. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom, instantly commanding the absolute attention of every single millionaire sitting in the audience. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Sylvia began, her voice deliberately soft and wavering. I know the past few weeks have been filled with horrific headlines and terrifying rumors. You have all read the newspapers. You have all seen the terrible things being said about my family. But I stand before you tonight, not as a wealthy socialite, but as a grieving, heartbroken mother who recently buried her youngest son. Sylvia paused expertly, squeezing her eyes shut, until a single perfectly timed tear rolled down her powdered cheek. A collective murmur of deep sympathy rippled through the wealthy crowd. Several elite women sitting in the front row actually reached into their designer purses to pull out silk handkerchiefs. My beautiful son David died in a tragic, terrible car accident. Sylvia continued, her voice cracking with fake emotion. But the absolute nightmare did not end with his funeral. In fact, it was only just beginning. As many of you know, David left behind a widow named Natalie. We tried to welcome her into our family with open arms. We tried to give her the luxurious life she could never afford on her own. But when my son tragically passed away, something inside of Natalie completely snapped. She suffered a severe and dangerous psychotic break. She simply could not handle the grief, and she directed all of her violent paranoia directly at me and my eldest son, Trent. Sylvia leaned closer to the microphone, lowering her voice to a harsh, dramatic whisper. She was furious that David legally wrote her out of his life insurance policy, so she decided to destroy us. Natalie used her background in corporate accounting to hire illegal cyber criminals. She paid them to maliciously hack into Trent's commercial bank and digitally fabricate fake wire transfers. She planted falsified offshore accounts and manipulated digital metadata to make it look like we were involved in David's accident. She orchestrated that horrific federal raid based on fabricated evidence just to steal my family estate. Trent stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on his mother's shoulder, playing the role of the protective son perfectly. My sister-in-law is a deeply disturbed, dangerous woman, Trent added, his voice echoing across the room. She froze all of our personal assets and tied us up in a malicious federal investigation. But the worst part is, she targeted this beautiful charity. She used rogue hackers to freeze the foundation accounts, preventing us from helping underprivileged children who rely on this money. We are begging for your help to fight back against this insane woman. Sylvia grabbed the heavy microphone again, her eyes scanning the crowded room hungrily. Please do not let a deranged, greedy widow destroy decades of our philanthropic work. Sylvia pleaded, tears streaming down her face. We desperately need your immediate financial support tonight. Every single check you write will go directly to bypassing these frozen accounts, so we can continue our mission. Please open your checkbooks to help us defeat this terrible injustice. The wealthy crowd began to applaud loudly, completely convinced by the brilliant theatrical lie. Wealthy investors sitting at the front tables were already reaching into their tailored jackets, ready to hand over millions of dollars to them. Sylvia stood at the wooden podium, soaking in the absolute adoration of the wealthy crowd. She watched with greedy anticipation as expensive leather checkbooks were pulled out across the grand ballroom. Trent stepped up to the edge of the stage, signaling the hired ushers to begin passing the heavy silver collection plates. The intricate web of lies had worked perfectly. They were mere seconds away from securing the untraceable cash they needed to flee the country and escape federal prison forever. But as the first pen touched paper, a sudden, deafening screech of electronic feedback blasted through the massive concert speakers. The wealthy guests flinched violently, covering their ears, as the harsh noise completely drowned out the soft classical background music. Sylvia dropped her microphone in pure shock. It hit the wooden stage floor with a loud thud that echoed through the room. Behind her, the massive high-definition projector screen spanning the entire width of the main stage began to glitch uncontrollably. The elegant gold logo of her fake children's foundation violently flickered and warped before instantly going completely black. The ballroom plunged into semi-darkness as the main overhead crystal chandeliers were remotely dimmed by the hacked building control system. "Turn the lights back on!" Sylvia shrieked frantically, waving her arms at the small production crew stationed at the back of the room. "Fix the screen right now!" But the production crew was completely locked out. Their computer monitors displayed a flashing red system override warning. The massive screen behind Sylvia suddenly flared back to life, illuminating her terrified face in a harsh, cold blue light. But it was no longer displaying the Foundation logo. It was projecting crystal-clear, high-definition security footage directly from the grand foyer of her own mansion. The wealthy guests lowered their hands, staring up at the massive screen in absolute, stunned silence. The footage was time-stamped exactly 3 weeks ago. It was the afternoon of my husband's funeral reception. The video showed little Leo standing nervously in his small black suit. It clearly captured the exact moment his elbow brushed the highboy table, spilling the ice water onto the marble floor. It showed Nadine violently shoving the grieving 8-year-old boy backward, causing him to fall hard onto the ground. A collective gasp of absolute horror rippled through the crowded ballroom. But the horrific video was not over. The footage showed Sylvia marching aggressively into the frame. Instead of helping her injured grandson, she raised her hand and viciously slapped the crying child across his face. In the background of the high-definition video, Trent could be seen leaning against the wall, laughing cruelly at the physical abuse of his own nephew. The wealthy socialites who had just been reaching for their checkbooks to support a children's charity watched in sheer disgust as the foundation founder violently assaulted an 8-year-old boy. The undeniable visual proof instantly shattered Sylvia's carefully crafted victim narrative. Women in the front row stood up from their tables, pointing angrily at the stage. "Turn it off!" Trent roared, his face turning purple with rage. He leaped off the stage and sprinted toward the audio-visual booth, shoving waiters out of his way. "Pull the plug on the projector!" But before Trent could even reach the back of the room, the visual on the massive screen shifted again. The security footage faded out and was replaced by a stark black screen displaying the glowing red logo of Trent's former commercial bank. Then a booming audio recording began to play through the massive concert speakers at maximum volume. It was Trent's own unmistakable voice, loud, clear, and completely unfiltered. The audio had been pulled directly from the secret burner phones Nadine told the federal agents about. "I do not care if the commercial loans are toxic." Trent's recorded voice echoed aggressively across the shocked ballroom. "Approve the real estate development funds immediately, and make sure my 20% cash kickback is wired to the offshore shell account by Friday. If the federal auditors start sniffing around, we will just bury the losses in my dead brother's accounts. I already forged his signature on the new life insurance directive. We are completely untouchable." The audio continued to play, looping the most damning confessions of corporate fraud and forgery for every major investor in the city to hear. The live stream cameras at the back of the room captured every single second of the brutal exposure, broadcasting the absolute destruction of their fake empire to the entire world. Sylvia stood frozen at the podium, her hands covering her face as the crowd erupted into outrage. Trent was trapped in the center aisle, surrounded by furious investors demanding answers. The charity gala had completely transformed into a public execution. The massive mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom suddenly swung open with a resounding physical crash. The heavy sound sliced right through the chaotic shouting of the furious crowd, instantly silencing the room. Every single head turned toward the entrance. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the warm golden light of the crystal chandeliers. For 8 years I had attended these high society events, wearing simple clearance rack dresses, trying my best to blend into the background and avoid Sylvia's cruel judgment. Tonight I was not hiding. I wore a perfectly tailored sharp white power suit that stood out fiercely against the sea of dark tuxedos and black evening gowns. Harrison Croft walked closely at my right side, carrying his thick leather briefcase, his face an intimidating mask of absolute legal authority. The sea of wealthy investors, socialites, and politicians immediately parted for me. They scrambled backward, pushing their chairs out of the way to clear a wide, unobstructed path down the center aisle. They looked at me with a mixture of awe and sheer, terrifying respect. I was no longer the pathetic, penniless widow they had gossiped about just 10 minutes ago. I was the architect of the most spectacular financial destruction this city had ever witnessed. My sleek heels clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor echoing clearly in the sudden breathless silence of the massive room. As I walked down the aisle, the sheer panic of the financial elite erupted around me. The wealthy commercial real estate developers and corporate board members who had just heard Trent explicitly confess to federal kickbacks realized their own portfolios were in immediate radioactive danger. The soft glow of hundreds of smartphone screens illuminated the dark edges of the ballroom as investors frantically dialed their crisis management teams. A prominent real estate tycoon standing just a few feet away from Trent held his phone to his ear and barked ruthless orders to his brokers. "Liquidate every single asset tied to that commercial branch right now," the tycoon shouted, completely ignoring Trent's desperate attempts to intervene. "Cancel the development contracts and freeze the escrow accounts. I want my money out of his bank tonight." Trent reached out, grabbing the tycoon's tailored sleeve, his eyes wide with absolute panic. "Please, you have to listen to me," Trent begged, his voice cracking pathetically. "That audio was completely fabricated. It is a fake recording. You cannot pull your investments. My bank will completely collapse." The tycoon violently yanked his arm away, shooting Trent a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Do not ever touch me again, you absolute criminal!" The tycoon spat, stepping back as if Trent were infected with a deadly disease. "You are going to federal prison, and I will personally testify against you if it keeps my name out of your federal indictment." Trent stumbled backward, his entire corporate empire dissolving into ashes right in front of his eyes. Further down the aisle, the harsh reality of unpaid debts was violently catching up with another member of the family. Nadine had quietly slipped into the back of the ballroom earlier in the evening, wearing a dark coat and large sunglasses. She had arrogantly hoped to watch her husband and mother-in-law go down in flames while she played the role of the innocent, cooperating witness. But her massive ego had blinded her to a crucial detail. The charity gala was heavily populated by the exact same wealthy vendors, luxury suppliers, and elite property managers she had systematically defrauded for years. A furious supplier recognized her face in the crowd. Within seconds, a tight, hostile circle of wealthy creditors completely surrounded Nadine. They backed her aggressively into the heavy velvet curtains, trapping her entirely. "Where is my $2 million, Nadine?" a prominent jewelry vendor shouted, pointing a furious finger right in her face. "You told me your boutiques were fully capitalized. You lied to my face and paid me with stolen money." Nadine pressed her back against the wall, desperately trying to shield her face from the flashing cameras. "I do not have your money," Nadine cried out, her voice entirely stripped of its usual arrogant superiority. "The government seized everything. Leave me alone." The creditors simply closed the circle tighter mercilessly, demanding their stolen funds and stripping away the last remaining shreds of her fake billionaire identity. I did not stop to watch Nadine's pathetic downfall. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the main stage. I walked past the frantic investors and the screaming creditors, moving with absolute, unwavering purpose. I reached the front of the ballroom and stood directly at the base of the carpeted steps. Trent was frozen in the center aisle to my left, utterly defeated. Sylvia remained trapped behind the wooden podium, looking down at me with wide, terrified eyes. The grand illusion was completely dead. I stopped walking when I was just 2 feet away from the wooden podium. The high-definition projector screen was still glowing brightly behind the stage, casting a harsh blue light over Sylvia's powdered face. The chaotic shouting in the grand ballroom slowly began to fade as the hundreds of wealthy guests realized I was about to speak. The elite crowd formed a tight circle around the front of the stage, holding up glowing cell phones to record every second of the confrontation. The live stream cameras at the back of the room zoomed in, locking their focus entirely on the massive power shift unfolding in real time. Trent stood in the center aisle, looking completely destroyed. The wealthy investors who had once kissed the ground he walked on had completely abandoned him. The real estate tycoons, the corporate board members, and the local politicians were actively scrambling to distance themselves from his radioactive name. The crushing realization that he had absolutely nothing left finally broke him. His knees gave out. Trent collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor right at my feet. The former regional bank director, the arrogant man who proudly threw a $45,000 funeral bill in my face and threatened to leave me homeless, dropped heavily onto his knees. Sylvia watched her golden child fall, and the last remaining shred of her false aristocratic pride completely shattered. She stumbled out from behind the wooden podium, her vintage black dress dragging across the stage. She descended the short, carpeted steps, her hands shaking violently. When she reached the floor, she did not stand tall. She collapsed right next to Trent. The elite high society matriarch who had built her entire identity on looking down at others was now kneeling on the floor in front of 300 cameras and the exact woman she had tried to destroy. "Natalie, please," Trent begged, his voice cracking as he looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. "You have to stop this. You have taken my job. You have taken my reputation. Please tell the federal agents that the audio was taken out of context. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. I am your brother-in-law, Natalie. We are family. You cannot send your family to a federal penitentiary." Sylvia grabbed the hem of my white power suit, her heavily powdered face streaked with black mascara. "I am so sorry, Natalie." Sylvia sobbed loudly, her voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "I was wrong to slap little Leo. I was just blinded by my grief. I was so heartbroken over losing David that I took it out on you and the boy. I will give you anything you want. I will sign the estate over to you without a fight. Just call off the lawyers. Please show us some mercy. We are the only family you have left." I looked down at the two of them, kneeling on the hard floor. This was the exact moment I had promised them on the day of David's funeral. They had demanded that I take my trash and leave. Now they were completely stripped of their wealth, their fake reputations, and their freedom. I glanced over my shoulder and saw Nadine in the back of the room. She was practically crawling on the floor trying to escape the vicious circle of wealthy creditors who were actively dialing the police to report her for massive financial fraud. The entire toxic triad was utterly decimated. I turned my attention back to Sylvia and Trent. I did not step away when Sylvia gripped my suit. I stood perfectly still, letting the hundreds of cameras capture their pathetic desperation. "You do not get to use the word family to save yourselves," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the massive ballroom. "Family does not forge legal documents to steal a child's college fund. Family does not embezzle millions of dollars to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle. And family certainly does not hire a violent mechanic to cut the brake lines of a good man just to collect a life insurance payout." A fresh wave of horrified gasps rippled through the wealthy crowd as I explicitly reminded them of the murder conspiracy. Trent buried his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. "You did not show David mercy when you decided his life was worth exactly $5 million. I continued, my voice hardening into absolute steel. "You did not show Leo mercy when you struck him across the face on the day he buried his father. You only understand mercy now because you face the end of your lives. But I am not here to grant you forgiveness. I am a forensic accountant. I am here to balance the ledger, and your account is completely bankrupt." I looked down at Sylvia and Trent kneeling on the polished hardwood floor. The heavy silence of the grand ballroom was broken only by the sound of their pathetic sobbing and the relentless clicking of hundreds of smartphone cameras capturing their ultimate disgrace. They had spent 8 long years trying to make me feel completely worthless. They had murdered a good man simply to cover up their own endless greed, and now they expected me to save them. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through the room like a sharpened blade. "I want you to remember the exact words you said to me on the day of my husband's funeral," I said, staring directly into Sylvia's tear-streaked eyes. "You slapped my grieving child across the face, pointed at the door, and told me to take my trash and leave. Well, Sylvia, I am giving you the exact same instructions right now. Take your trash and leave. Only here tonight you are the trash." Sylvia flinched as if I had physically struck her. Trent dropped his head, completely defeated. Before either of them could beg for mercy a second time, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open once again. This time, it was not angry investors or wealthy creditors stepping through the entrance. A dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets marched swiftly down the center aisle. The lead detective from the conference room walked right at the front of the formation, holding a stack of federal warrants. The high society crowd parted frantically to let them through, eager to completely distance themselves from the radioactive criminals kneeling on the floor. Sylvia and Trent, you have explicitly violated the strict terms of your federal bail. The lead detective announced, his voice booming over the quiet room. You are both under immediate arrest. The agents moved in without any hesitation. They grabbed Trent by his arms, hauling him forcefully to his feet and snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Two other agents pulled Sylvia up from the floor, ignoring her hysterical wailing as they secured her wrists behind her back. Nadine had not managed to escape either. I watched as federal marshals cornered her near the emergency exit, reading her a massive list of corporate fraud charges before placing her securely in handcuffs. The elite charity gala had completely transformed into a massive federal crime scene. I did not stay to watch them get dragged out the front doors. I turned my back on the entire toxic family forever. Harrison Croft gave me a brief, respectful nod before turning to handle the remaining federal paperwork with the lead detective. I walked calmly back up the center aisle, moving past the shocked investors and the shattered remnants of Sylvia's fake foundation. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom and stepped right out into the cold, crisp winter night. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing air fill my lungs. For the first time in 8 long years, I felt completely clean. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute freedom. Fast forward exactly 1 year. The dark, toxic shadow of my former in-laws is completely gone from our lives. Trent and Sylvia were both found guilty on all federal charges and sentenced to life in a maximum security penitentiary without the possibility of parole. Nadine took a plea deal and is currently serving 15 years for wire fraud and tax evasion. The massive estate was liquidated, and the corrupt commercial bank branch was heavily fined and permanently shut down. But none of that matters to me anymore. I'm sitting on the back porch of my beautiful new home located in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, far away from the toxic elite circles of the city. The warm spring sun is shining brightly over the green backyard. I watch with a huge smile on my face as my 9-year-old son Leo runs across the grass, chasing our newly adopted golden retriever. His laughter rings through the air, completely unburdened and full of pure joy. He is safe. His entire future is completely guaranteed through an ironclad, irrevocable trust that absolutely no one can ever touch. I took off my black mourning clothes a long time ago. I am now running my own independent forensic accounting firm, helping other vulnerable people track down hidden assets and fight back against corporate predators. I learned the hardest way possible that true power does not come from a wealthy family name or a massive inheritance. True power comes from absolute financial independence, standing firmly in your own truth, and executing with cold forensic precision. Thank you for listening to my story today. Please like this video and subscribe. The story we just explored reveals a profound and terrifying truth about toxic family dynamics. For 8 long years, Natalie hid her immense success and intelligence to protect the fragile egos of her deeply insecure in-laws. She shrank herself to fit their cruel narrative, mistakenly believing that staying quiet and humble would eventually keep the peace. But the greatest lesson we can take from this incredible story is that shrinking yourself to accommodate toxic people will never, ever earn their respect. It only emboldens them to abuse you further. Her in-laws completely mistook her quiet grace for weakness and her humility for sheer incompetence. When you allow other people to dictate your worth or control your narrative, you give them the unchecked power to completely destroy your life. Natalie only found true justice and safety when she stopped playing by their twisted rules and stepped fully into her own undeniable power. Her absolute financial independence and her unwavering commitment to the truth became her ultimate armor against their intense gaslighting. We must learn to build our own lives so solidly that no one can ever threaten to throw us out into the cold. Real independence is not just about having money in the bank. It is about having the unshakable confidence to look your abusers directly in the eye and absolutely refuse to accept their lies as your reality. We do not ever have to endure relentless disrespect or cruelty just because someone shares a bloodline or a legal marriage certificate with us. True family protects you while toxic people will only try to exploit you. Please share this video with someone who might need the courage to finally stand up to the toxic people in their own life.